The day I became the most hated person in my neighborhood was the day I discovered I owned it. It started, as these things often do, with a seemingly trivial infraction, a ridiculous $150 fine slapped onto my door for a fishing boat that had been perfectly acceptable for generations. But what she, the self-appointed queen of the homeowners association, didn't know was that I had inherited something far more valuable than a simple lakeside cabin. I promised you wouldn't see this ending coming, and I intend to deliver on that. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in my situation, because what I did next shook the entire community to its core. My name is Liam, and for most of my adult life, I had been a corporate lawyer. Not the glamorous, courtroom drama kind, but the behind-the-scenes, deeply meticulous M&A specialist who could dissect a corporate structure or a property deed down to its foundational molecules. For 2 decades, I had navigated the treacherous waters of multi-million-dollar deals, where a single misplaced comma could unravel an empire. The work was exhilarating, intellectually stimulating, and utterly soul-crushing in its relentless pace. I had burned out, not a slow, smoldering ember, but a supernova of exhaustion that left me hollowed out and craving an antidote. My antidote came in the form of a small, rustic cabin on the shores of Lake Serenity, a place my grandfather had built with his own calloused hands, a place he had called his thinking spot. That cabin and the pristine lake it overlooked was my sanctuary. It was a place where the air tasted of pine and cool water, where the only deadlines were the rising sun and the setting moon, and where the only deals I contemplated involved the delicate dance of a fishing lure. After a particularly brutal year that ended with a quiet, mutual divorce, a casualty of my all-consuming career, the cabin became more than just a retreat. It was my therapy, my restoration. My grandfather, a man of quiet wisdom and deep connection to the land, had often said, "The lake gives you back what you put into it, Liam. Respect it, and it will respect you." I remembered his words as I spent hours drifting in my small aluminum fishing boat, the same boat he had taught me to pilot, casting lines, or simply watching the sunlight dapple on the water's surface. It was a place where I felt his presence, a tangible connection to a legacy of peace and quiet fortitude. The cabin itself was simple, unpretentious, but every plank, every window pane held a memory. It wasn't about luxury, it was about legacy. The tranquility, however, was shattered not by a storm, but by a force far more insidious. Brenda Sterling, the newly elected president of the Lake Serenity Homeowners Association. Brenda was, to put it mildly, a caricature. She possessed that universal, I want to speak to the manager haircut, a severe, asymmetrical bob that seemed perpetually poised for combat. Her features were sharp, her eyes perpetually narrowed, as if perpetually suspicious of the world. She carried herself with an air of self-importance that bordered on the theatrical, always impeccably dressed in crisp, expensive linens that seemed ill-suited to lakeside living. Her primary mode of transportation was a gleaming, oversized German luxury SUV, which she piloted with an aggressive disregard for speed limits or common courtesy, especially when traversing the narrow, winding dirt road that led to the more rustic, older cabins like mine. Brenda was, for lack of a better term, a gilded cage on legs, and she seemed determined to enclose Lake Serenity within her personal brand of order. She had only been in office for 6 months, but in that short time, the neighborhood had transformed from a sleepy, congenial community into a labyrinth of petty rules, arbitrary fines, and a suffocating atmosphere of distrust. The inciting incident arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered with the subtlety of a freight train. I was sitting on my small, weathered dock, just minding my own business, respooling a fishing reel, when Brenda's gleaming SUV screeched to a halt on the gravel path 50 yards away. She emerged, a vision in pristine white, and marched towards me, her gait stiff with indignation. "Mr. Davies," she began, her voice a reedy pronouncement that cut through the chirping of crickets, "we have an issue." I looked up, feigning mild surprise. "It's Davies, actually. Liam Davies." "And an issue, Brenda?" "The only issue I see is you disturbing my peace." She sniffed, a dismissive gesture. Your boat. It's non-compliant. I glanced at my humble aluminum skiff, tied securely to the dock. Non-compliant with what? Pray tell? It's registered, insured, and has been floating on this lake for 60 years. HOA Rule 73, subsection B, she recited, as if reading from a holy scripture, prohibits the use of unpainted, non-recreational aluminum vessels within the Lake Serenity watershed. All watercraft must be fiberglass or composite, painted in approved earth tones, and no older than 10 years. Furthermore, all vessels must be docked at the communal marina, not on private docks, to ensure aesthetic uniformity and equitable access. I stared at her, genuinely dumbfounded. Equitable access? You mean, I can't keep my own boat on my own dock? A boat that my grandfather built? This is my property, Brenda. The lake, she corrected, jabbing a manicured finger towards the water, is communal property, owned and managed by the Homeowners Association for the benefit of all residents. Your dock, Mr. Davies, extends onto HOA property, and my boat is part of my property. I countered, my voice still calm, though a spark of irritation was beginning to ignite within me. It's been here for decades. Never been an issue. Well, it is now, she declared, pulling a pre-printed citation book from her designer handbag. Violation, non-compliant watercraft, unapproved docking. Fine, $150. You have 48 hours to remove the vessel to the marina, or face additional penalties. She scribbled something on the form, tore it off, and practically threw it onto the dock beside me. This community is moving forward, Mr. Davies. We're enhancing property values, ensuring a harmonious living environment. We don't need relics holding us back. With that, she spun on her heel and strutted back to her SUV, leaving me with the absurd citation and a lingering scent of expensive perfume. My first instinct was anger, a hot, familiar surge from my corporate days. The sheer audacity, the blatant disregard for established norms, the patronizing tone, it all grated on me. $150. It wasn't about the money, of course. It was the principle, the blatant power grab. I sat there for a long time, the citation crumpled in my hand, watching the ripples from my dock spread across the lake. Part of me, the part that craved peace, wanted to simply comply. Pay the fine, move the boat, and avoid the headache. I was here to escape conflict, not to invite it. But another part, a deeper, more stubborn current that ran through my veins, rebelled. My grandfather had fought for this land, had protected this lake. He had instilled in me a quiet pride in ownership, a belief that one's word was their bond, and that bullies, no matter how well dressed, deserved to be confronted. My mind replayed Brenda's words. We don't need relics holding us back. She wasn't just talking about my boat. She was talking about my legacy, my connection to this place, to my family. That was a line I would not allow to be crossed. This wasn't just about a boat or a fine anymore. It was about principle. It was about defending what was mine. I would not be bullied, especially not by someone whose arrogance blinded them to the very fabric of the community they purported to serve. That night, the quiet calm of my sanctuary was replaced by a relentless intellectual storm. The lawyer in me, dormant for months, began to stir. I pulled out old property deeds, dusty folders my grandfather had left behind, even an ancient, hand-drawn map of the property. Brenda had invoked HOA Rule 73, subsection B. Fine. I would examine Rule 73, subsection B, and every rule before and after it. I'd examine the very foundation of the HOA's authority. My professional expertise was not in community disputes, but I understood contracts, property law, and the often hidden vulnerabilities within seemingly ironclad agreements. I knew how to follow a paper trail, how to trace ownership, how to spot inconsistencies that others overlooked. My corporate career had taught me patience, meticulousness, and the unyielding pursuit of facts. Now, I would turn those very skills against Brenda. This was no longer just a personal affront. It was a complex legal puzzle, and I was going to solve it. My investigation began quietly, almost imperceptibly. I started with the HOA's public records, requesting their founding documents, their articles of incorporation, their land deeds, anything that defined their legal scope and authority. Brenda's assistant, a nervous young woman named Sarah who seemed perpetually on the verge of tears, provided me with a thick binder. I pored over it, coffee-fueled and relentless for days. I cross-referenced names, dates, and property descriptions with county land records, going back decades. I spent hours at the county clerk's office, sifting through microfiche, digitizing old documents on my phone. The digital age had made this kind of deep dive infinitely easier, and I exploited every available resource. I looked for anomalies, for missing pieces, for anything that didn't quite line up. This was my battleground now, a war of information, and I was armed with a legal mind honed by 2 decades of corporate combat. And then I found it. It wasn't a smoking gun, not immediately. It was a faint, almost invisible thread that, when tugged, began to unravel the entire tapestry of Brenda's authority. Tucked away in an obscure appendix of the original development plans, dating back to the 1960s when my grandfather first sold a portion of his land to the developer, was a series of meticulously worded easements and carve-outs. The developer had bought the land around the lake to build the community, but the lake itself, and a significant buffer of surrounding land, had been retained by my grandfather. He had granted the developer a right of access to the lake for community recreational use, but crucially, he had never transferred ownership of the lakebed or the riparian rights. My grandfather had been a shrewd man, a man who understood the value of holding onto what was truly precious. He had simply allowed the new community access, a generosity born of a bygone era. The document that sealed it was a quitclaim deed, filed years later, explicitly transferring the ownership of the lakebed and the surrounding 20 acres of undeveloped land, including the very ground my dock stood on, directly to my grandfather's trust, and upon his passing, to me. The HOA, in their haste and apparent lack of due diligence, had either overlooked it entirely or, more likely, assumed their general communal property clause superseded it. They had been collecting fees, making rules, and generally acting as if they owned the lake, all without truly possessing the title. Brenda's entire dominion, it turned out, was built on a foundation of sand. The lake was not communal property. It was my property. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, a stunning, profound wave of understanding that transcended mere legal victory. This was not just about a boat or a fine. It was about the very land my family had cherished, a legacy I had almost, in my desire for peace, allowed to be trampled. The sleeping giant, as my former colleagues used to call me, was wide awake. The first person I called was Professor Davies. Not a relative, but my former property law professor from law school, now retired and living a quiet life of gardening and obscure historical fiction. He was a man of immense intellect, dry wit, and a formidable reputation for dissecting complex land disputes. I explained the situation, detailing my findings, citing document numbers, and legal precedents. He listened patiently, interjecting only with the occasional or indeed. "Liam," he finally said, his voice a low rumble over the phone, "if what you found is accurate, and knowing your meticulous nature, I have no doubt it is, then you, my boy, hold the keys to the kingdom. Not just the lake, but the very legality of the HOA's existence, at least as far as their jurisdiction over that body of water is concerned. They've been operating under a fundamental misapprehension, or worse, deliberate misrepresentation. This isn't just a win for you. It's a complete dismantling of their authority." He advised caution, strategy. Don't tip your hand too soon, Liam. Let them overplay theirs. Document everything, every interaction, every threat, every fine. Build an insurmountable case. And remember, he added, a chuckle in his voice, the quietest bomb makes the biggest boom. Armed with validation from a master of his craft, I began to formulate my master plan. It was a multi-phase strategy, a tactical exercise in patience and precision, much like preparing for a hostile takeover in the corporate world. Phase 1, observe and document. Phase 2, subtle challenge. Phase 3, allow antagonist overreach. Phase 4, decisive strike. My objective was not merely to win, but to ensure Brenda Sterling's complete and utter downfall, to strip her of every shred of authority and influence she had so arrogantly wielded. I was going to pull the rug out from under her so thoroughly she'd land flat on her face, and the entire community would see it happen. Evidence gathering became my new full-time occupation. I installed a discreet, motion-activated security camera near my dock, ostensibly to deter wildlife, but primarily to capture any further attempts by the HOA to interfere with my property. My smartphone became an extension of my hand, ready to record any interaction with Brenda or her cronies. I started subtly engaging with other residents, not complaining, but asking innocuous questions about their experiences with the HOA, specifically about lake access and fines. I quickly discovered I was not alone. The quiet community had been simmering with resentment. Mrs. Henderson, a sweet elderly woman, had been fined for her grandkids swimming too loudly. Mr. Kim, a Vietnam veteran, had been forced to move his small, carefully tended vegetable patch because it violated aesthetic guidelines. There was a collective fear, a quiet despair at Brenda's reign. I encouraged them, subtly, to keep records, to note times and dates, to take photos. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was gathering an army of silent witnesses. My first move was designed to be a gentle poke, a test of Brenda's arrogance. I didn't send a full legal brief. Instead, I drafted a polite, yet meticulously worded letter, ostensibly as a concerned resident, questioning the legal basis of the HOA's authority over the lake. I cited specific sections of their own bylaws that seemed to contradict their actions, particularly regarding riparian rights and established easements. I didn't mention my ownership directly, merely posed it as a series of well-researched questions. I mailed it with a return receipt requested. My corporate experience had taught me that a well-placed, seemingly innocent question could plant a seed of doubt, or, in Brenda's case, ignite a furious overreaction. Brenda's response was exactly what I had predicted: dismissive, arrogant, and disproportionate. She sent me a scathing email, CCGNG the entire HOA board, calling my letter vexatious and an egregious waste of HOA resources. She doubled my non-compliant boat fine to $300 and added a new $100 fine for repeated frivolous inquiries. She also announced, via a community-wide email, that due to persistent defiance, new, more stringent rules would be implemented regarding lake usage, including mandatory HOA-approved permits for all watercraft and a complete ban on private docks. Within days, crude, hand-painted "no trespassing" HOA property signs appeared around the lake's perimeter, including directly in front of my cabin, planted defiantly just inches from my actual property line. It was a direct, contemptuous challenge, and it thrilled me. She was digging her own grave with every stroke of the brush. But the line was truly crossed a week later. I was out for a morning stroll, coffee in hand, when I saw two burly men from Brenda's newly hired HOA compliance team actively dismantling my small fishing dock. They were pulling up planks, tossing them haphazardly onto the bank. This wasn't just a fine or a sign. This was physical destruction of property. My property. The dock, though old, was sturdy, a gift from my grandfather built by his hands. It was a deeply personal violation. I felt a cold, hard knot of resolve tighten in my stomach. Any lingering desire for a peaceful resolution evaporated. This was war. What in the blazes do you think you're doing? I demanded, striding towards them. One of them, a man with a shaved head and a neck tattoo, merely grunted. HOA order. Dock's gotta go. Unapproved structure. Unapproved by whom? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. This dock has been here for 60 years. Brenda's SUV pulled up then, as if on cue, Brenda emerging with a triumphant smirk. Mr. Davies, just making sure our beautiful communal lake is pristine. Your unauthorized structure was an eyesore. And a hazard, no doubt. A hazard. I repeated, my gaze fixed on the splintered wood. You've just destroyed private property, Brenda. That's not a fine. That's vandalism. On HOA land, she retorted, puffing out her chest. You're trespassing, Mr. Davies. And now you're interfering with legitimate HOA operations. I'm calling the authorities. Be my guest, I said, a faint, chilling smile touching my lips. I insist. She pulled out her phone, dialed, and in a loud, dramatic voice, began reporting a disruptive individual interfering with community maintenance on HOA property. Refusing to comply with directives, the police arrived within 15 minutes, 2 patrol cars, lights flashing. Officer Miller, a seasoned local cop, emerged looking weary. He knew Brenda, and by the slight tremor in his jaw, it was clear he knew her particular brand of manufactured drama. "All right, Brenda," he said, holding up a hand. "What's the situation here?" Brenda, emboldened by the arrival of official authority, immediately launched into a theatrical tirade, gesturing wildly at my boat, my destroyed dock, and me. "This man, Officer Mr. Davies, he's a menace. He refuses to obey HOA rules, keeps an unsightly boat, built an unauthorized dock, and now he's interfering with our authorized personnel attempting to remove the offending structure from HOA property. He's practically trespassing on communal land." Officer Miller turned to me, his expression resigned. "Mr. Davies? Care to explain?" This was it, the moment I had been waiting for, the carefully cultivated climax of my strategy. I took a deep, centering breath. "Officer Miller," I began, my voice clear and measured, cutting through Brenda's indignant sputtering. "I'd be happy to. But first, perhaps Miss Sterling could clarify one small point for the record. Miss Sterling, you claim this lake and the land my dock stood on is HOA property, correct?" Brenda puffed up, her eyes narrowed in suspicion at my calm tone. "Of course. It's communal property, owned by the association, and your authority to establish rules, collect fines, and dismantle structures on this communal property stems from that ownership. Yes?" I continued, sounding like a prosecuting attorney guiding a witness. "Precisely," she declared, convinced she was winning. "Excellent," I said, and then I deployed my weapon. I pulled out a neatly folded stack of documents from the waterproof pouch I kept in my pocket. "Officer Miller, Brenda, these are certified copies of the original property deeds, the developer's land acquisition documents, the Lake Serenity HOA founding charter, and, crucially, a quitclaim deed filed in 1978. They clearly establish, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that while the HOA owns the land around the lake bed itself, along with a 20-acre conservation buffer that includes my dock and the immediate shoreline, was never, I repeat, never transferred to the developer or the homeowners association. It was retained by my grandfather and legally conveyed to me upon his passing. The Lake Serenity Homeowners Association," I stated, my voice echoing slightly across the water, "does not, and has never, owned Lake Serenity." Brenda's jaw went slack. Her carefully constructed facade shattered. The color drained from her face, leaving her a ghastly white. She looked like a fish gasping for air. Officer Miller took the documents, his brow furrowed as he scanned them. He was a local, he knew the history of the old families, and I could see the dawning comprehension in his eyes. This is legitimate?" he asked, looking up from the papers, his gaze shifting from me to Brenda, then back to the documents. "Every single page," I confirmed, certified by the county clerk's office. Professor Arthur Davies, a former property law professor from the State University, has also reviewed and validated my findings. The HOA has been acting for decades as if it owns property it does not, and in doing so has been unlawfully issuing fines, restricting access, and now illegally destroying private property. Property that belongs to me. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant caw of a crow. Brenda, usually so quick with a retort, stood utterly frozen, her mouth slightly ajar. Her eyes darted from me to the documents in the officer's hand, then to her compliance team, who now looked distinctly uncomfortable. Officer Miller handed the documents back to me, then turned to Brenda, his voice firm, losing its weary edge. "Brenda, if what Mr. Davies says is true, and these documents appear to be in order, then you have a very serious problem on your hands. You've been operating without jurisdiction over this lake, and damaging Mr. Davies' property is a criminal matter. I suggest you cease all activity immediately and consult with your legal counsel. This isn't a zoning dispute. This is potential grand theft and fraud. Brenda finally found her voice, a strangled, desperate squeak. But the HOA? We've always managed the lake. It's our lake. Apparently not, Brenda, I said, my voice cutting through her panic. It's my lake. And your HOA compliance team just committed vandalism on my private property at your direction. I have it all on camera, by the way. Every swing of the hammer, every splintering plank. I gestured subtly to the discreet camera near my cabin. Her face contorted in a mix of fury, disbelief, and sheer terror. The power she had so greedily hoarded had just vanished in a thin air. A few neighbors, drawn by the police lights, had gathered at a distance, murmuring. Mr. Kim was there, and Mrs. Henderson. They watched, their eyes wide with disbelief, then dawning understanding. The Queen had been dethroned. Officer Miller made it clear. The compliance team was to pack up their tools and leave immediately. He advised Brenda that I had every right to press charges for property damage and potentially for fraud related to the long history of illegal fines. He then told her, in no uncertain terms, that if she or anyone from the HOA attempted to interfere with my lake or my property again, they would face immediate arrest. Brenda Sterling, the woman who ruled Lake Serenity with an iron fist, was reduced to a sputtering, humiliated mess. She tried to bluster, to threaten, to appeal to a non-existent authority, but it was useless. The police had confirmed it. I owned the lake. She was nothing more than a trespasser, a vandal, standing on my land, having destroyed my property. She stumbled back to her luxury SUV, her face a blotchy crimson, her compliance team trailing behind her, looking sheepish. She drove away in a cloud of dust, leaving behind a silence far more profound than the one she had shattered with her initial fine. The air itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Brenda. News travels fast in a small community, especially when it involves police cars, a public meltdown, and the revelation that the tyrannical HOA president was a fraud. Within days, the HOA board, fearing lawsuits and a complete collapse of their legitimacy, convened an emergency meeting. Brenda, clinging to the last vestiges of her power, attempted to deny everything, to claim I had fabricated documents. But the county clerk's office confirmed the validity of my deeds. Professor Davies even provided a formal legal opinion, published in a local paper, backing my claim. Faced with irrefutable evidence and the threat of personal liability, the board quietly requested her resignation. She initially refused, but when the first lawsuit, a class action filing led by me on behalf of the fined residents, landed on her doorstep, she folded. She resigned in disgrace, her reputation in tatters. The lawsuits, fueled by the evidence I had meticulously collected, piled up, not just against Brenda personally, but against the HOA for operating outside its charter. Faced with massive legal fees and the certainty of losing, the HOA was forced to settle, refunding all lake-related fines and fees. Brenda herself faced significant financial ruin. She was forced to sell her lavish home at a steep discount, practically fleeing the community under a cloud of scorn and ridicule. Her gleaming SUV was gone, replaced by the grim reality of legal bills and the quiet, damning judgment of a community she had tried to subjugate. Now in a position of undeniable power, I didn't seek revenge or further humiliation. That had already been delivered. Instead, I established a new order, one based on fairness and community. I called a meeting of the residents, not as their landlord, but as their neighbor. I explained the history of the lake, my grandfather's original intent for shared enjoyment, and my desire to honor that legacy. I announced the formation of the Lake Serenity Conservation Trust, a nonprofit entity that would own and manage the lake, ensuring its preservation for future generations. I drafted new, simple rules for lake access, respectful use, no motorized boats over a certain size to preserve the quiet, and clear guidelines for docks and fishing. All residents would have free, equitable access to the lake, provided they adhered to these common-sense rules, which would be enforced by a small, elected volunteer committee, not a tyrannical board. The community, relieved and grateful, embraced the changes. A new, ethical HOA board was elected, focused on genuine community well-being, not on petty regulations or power grabs. Lake Serenity, at long last, lived up to its name. Today, the cabin remains my sanctuary. I still sit on my rebuilt dock, the same old aluminum skiff tied securely beside it, casting lines into the placid water. The quiet has returned, a deeper, more profound quiet than before, because it is now infused with a sense of peace and justice restored. I often think of my grandfather, whose quiet foresight had gifted me not just a piece of land, but the leverage to protect an entire community. I had a small, tasteful plaque installed on a sturdy oak tree near the shoreline, dedicating the Lake Serenity Conservation Trust in his honor. It simply reads, "In memory of Arthur Davies, who believed in shared waters and quiet strength." The moral of the story is simple. True power isn't about the loudest voice or the biggest car. It's about knowledge, about patience, and about the unwavering courage to stand up for what's right, especially when a bully mistakes your quiet demeanor for weakness. They say that karma is a slow-burning fire, but sometimes, with a well-placed legal document and a bit of resolve, you can douse an entire inferno in an instant. If you enjoyed this story of justice, serve, and bullies getting their comeuppance, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss my next tale. What's the most absurd HOA rule you've ever encountered? Let me know in the comments. And remember, sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the biggest secret. Stay tuned for more stories about turning the tables on those who think they're in charge.